Join us. My name is Bethany Pearson. I am the program and volunteer coordinator for the Everett Rail Marshfield Public Library. And thank you so much for joining us this evening for our Garden Guru, Garden Planning and Planting. If you have any questions or if there are any technical issues, anything that I can help with, please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. That is handy for me to be able to just answer really quick, easy questions that are either pertaining to can't hear something, screen is looking weird, anything like that. Asking if we have a material at the library, things like that that I can help with, you can use the chat for. Use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen for any questions directed to our presenter regarding either this evening's topic or gardening at large, because we do want to encourage questions that are specifically about this. But if you have other gardening questions, we will also be able to answer those this evening as well. You can also use that either feature if you think of a program suggestion for the gardening topics. Use either of those features to let us know, and I will take note of those so that I can pass them on to the Wood County Master Gardener volunteers so that they can see if anybody would be able to do a presentation on that to bring that information to you. So it's a great opportunity to be able to see something you would like to, you personally would like to see. But I think I'm going to stop rambling here. I'm going to hand the reins over to this program to our volunteer this evening, Donna.
Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Just hang on for a minute. And I need to start from the beginning, because once I open this up, I can't see anything else on the screen. Okay, can everybody see? Are we okay that way?
You should be good.
Okay. And now when I'm in this mode, I can't see the questions either. So if somebody has a question and it's pertaining to what we're talking about at the time, you can interrupt me and we'll answer it. Okay, we're going to talk today about planning your garden and planting it. And we're going to go over the 4 W's and 1 H of planting. Why do we want to plant a garden? Well, there are a couple good reasons. It's probably the freshest food you can get. When you buy things from the store, they are at least days to a week old or more since it's been picked. And if you know anything about vegetable storage, the longer you keep it in storage, the more nutrients and things that it loses. If you want to a real taste test, and most of you probably are familiar with this, compare a tomato you bought in the store with one that you picked fresh from a garden and ate it within minutes or hours of when it was picked. You just can't find that kind of freshness. You also can plant varieties that you can't find in the store. For example, if you want a specific kind of plant that has a disease resistance that you have in your area, or you want a short maturing kind of, let's say, beans or corn, or maybe you want a tomato with a special characteristics, like you want to make a sauce or paste out of it versus a tomato that you're going to use for fresh slicing. So you can get those different kinds of varieties especially if you order your own seeds. The nutrition of foods, like we said, kind of goes down the longer it's sitting around before it's eaten. Gardening also provides exercise. Gardening is considered moderate exercise, and we're supposed to get like at least 150 minutes of that every week. It also exposes you to fresh air, and we know that that's good for people also. It's a family-friendly activity. You can get kids involved. They're much more likely to eat what they grow. And there's a pride and accomplishment that you can say when you put this on your table at home, I grew this in my garden. So deciding what to plant. What are you going to plant if you're starting a garden? Okay, I would suggest that you start with your personal tastes. What plants do you like and you will eat? Don't grow anything exotic that you say, well, I just like to try this. because cost-wise, it's not real effective. So grow what your family will eat and what you will eat. And then you can always experiment after that. You also have to take into consideration how much space you have to grow vegetables. Vegetables can be grown in containers, or you can grow like an acre of a vegetable garden. So you need to know how much space you have. Some vegetables take up a lot more space, things that vine and creep along the ground like cucumbers and melons, squash and pumpkins take up a lot of space. And if you have a small space only to garden in, these are not very space efficient vegetables to grow. The same thing with sweet corn. You need at least a 4x4 or 6x6 area of sweet corn for it to pollinate well, because it's wind pollinated. So if you have a small space for gardening, choose those vegetables that are going to be space efficient, like tomatoes and peppers and lettuce, carrots, beets, radishes, spinach. Those kinds of things will give you a lot more bang for your space than, say, growing a broccoli plant or some corn plants or a cucumber plant. The site conditions are also going to determine what you can grow. If you have an area that's only sunny for part of the day, most of the vegetables that grow fruits like cucumbers, peppers, and tomatoes need at least, at very minimum, 6 hours of sun a day, and they really do best with full sun. If you have only a part shady site, stick with leafy greens and root crops, because they will produce fairly well under those conditions. And then you need to consider too, what are you going to grow from seed, and what are you going to grow start out as a transplant or plant? And this will depend on the kind of vegetable that you're growing. Some of them have a long maturing season, like tomatoes. If you were to plant the seed of tomatoes in the garden, you might not get ripe tomatoes even before it freezes here, at least in Wisconsin, which is where we are. So plants that take a long time to grow from seed until you can actually harvest them need to be started as plants. So a little bit more on that. The longer growing season, things like peppers, tomatoes, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, cabbage, eggplant, those are the kind of things that you probably will want to start with transplants that you would buy in a garden center, or if you start them from seed yourself. Avoid buying the cucumbers, melon, and squash plants, because they have very tender roots and they do not transplant well. And so you're just as far ahead to put those right straight in the ground. Seeds should be used for all other plants. And seeds are much cheaper to buy than plants too. You can buy a whole packet of seeds for the price of one plant or less. So most of your plants should be done from seeds. When you buy seeds, be sure that you read the package. There are different kinds of vegetables. For example, pole beans versus bush beans. Pole beans will grow 6 to 8 feet tall and need to be grown on a trellis or a fence or some sort of thing to support them. There are two kinds of tomatoes too, determinate and indeterminate. Determinate will get about 3 feet tall, and they tend to produce all their fruits over a short season. Indeterminate tomatoes will sometimes grow, again, 6 to 8 feet long vines, and they won't quit producing tomatoes until they freeze. So look at that description very carefully. If you're trying to grow something in pots or containers, you're going to look for varieties that say bush, dwarf, patio, some of those names in their name, or it will say a special variety for growing in containers. Look at the days to maturity too. You can get sweet corn and tomatoes that ripen in, say, 60 days, and you can get some that go 90 days. So you need to, at least in Wisconsin, you probably want to buy seeds that have shorter days to maturity to make sure that you get the vegetables before it freezes. Look at the plant size at maturity so you know how far to space the plants apart. If you want to grow pepper plants in a 4x4 area, you're probably going to only be able to grow 4 plants there, because the mature size means that that one plant will take up about a foot of space or a little bit more. So that's all you're going to be able to grow in a 4x4 area. Look at special qualities of a variety. Does it say it's extra sweet? Does it say it works good for canning or freezing? Does it say it's better for fresh eating? So look at those kinds of clues too in the description of the seeds. Does it have some resistance to disease, like verticillium in tomatoes and blights in tomatoes, potatoes? So you want to look at those kinds of things. Is there resistance to mildew in spinach? So if you have a seed that has resistance, it means it's less likely to get it. Doesn't mean that it's never going to get it, but it will be less likely to get that disease. And I said earlier, look at your growing conditions. How much sun do you have? And that may determine what kind of seeds you can purchase. And there are many different sources for seeds. Many of them can be bought on the internet now, and that probably gives you a much greater variety of seeds than you'll find in your big box stores and like supermarkets that put out a display of seeds for a short time in the spring, but then they're gone. So places like garden centers and online websites will probably give you a greater variety of seeds, and there'll be people there to answer your questions too. If you're going to be buying plants, these are some things you need to look for. Look for insects or insect damage, things like holes in the leaves that look kind of mottled, or the color is not consistent through the whole leaf. Check for diseases like spots on the leaves. Does the lower leaf surface look fuzzy? That could indicate some kind of a mold or bacteria. Blotchy leaves, light areas between the leaf veins. In other words, you're looking for a plant that looks very perky and nice and green and doesn't look sickly at all. You can also check the root ball too. You can turn the pot over, put the stem between your first and second, or your second and third fingers, and turn the pot upside down. So you're holding the plant from the bottom, and you can pull the container off. The roots should be white. If they're brown or mushy looking, that indicates rot and they've been overwatered. And those will not grow as well. Avoid plants that are already blooming, like tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. It's not true if you say, oh, this plant already has tomatoes on it, I'll really get early tomatoes. You might get some early tomatoes, but you probably won't get many tomatoes. The same thing with peppers. When you transplant the plant, it has to have time for the roots to develop before it starts making flowers and fruits. So avoid the plants that are already blooming, especially if you're going to be transplanting them. If you buy a tomato in a container that will stay in that container, that's a different story, because that will not be transplanted and it's already got a good established root. Again, if you go to garden centers, they may be a little bit more expensive, but generally their plants are probably better taken care of because they are in it for the long haul. You won't come back if you don't like their plants. They can also tell you a whole lot about the different kinds of plants too. So if you're wondering, should I get this one or that one? Someone in the garden center will probably be very knowledgeable and be able to steer you in the right direction. And we say use reputable dealers so that if something goes wrong, you can go back and say, I planted this and look what happened to it. You can't do that with the big box stores because their garden center is probably closed by the time you discover your plant isn't doing well. Okay, planting your garden, where to plant. We said it, you need full sun, at least 6 hours. 8 hours is even better, or all day sun. Check out how the shadows will fall on the garden all season from buildings and trees and things. When you plant in May, the sun is almost at its highest point for the year, and there may not be many shadows on your growing area, but will the trees that are in your neighbor's yard start shading your garden by the end of July? So you need to look at that, shade from buildings and that sort of thing too. Do not plant near black walnut trees, whether they're alive or dead, or if there was a black walnut tree growing in that area. Many plants are very, very sensitive to the juglone toxin in the black walnut plant. And it could be in the seeds, the nuts, the walnuts. It could be in the roots, could be in the leaves. It even stays in the soil after the tree is gone. So avoid that. Soil quality. Do a soil test if you're starting a new garden. It costs only $15. You send it to the Soil and Forage Analysis Lab in Marshfield, Wisconsin, and they will do a soil test and tell you if you need to amend your soil in any way before you start planting. It's well worth the $15 when you're starting a new garden. Look for the slope in your, if you're in an area, you may have to use some kind of a elevated bed, or not an elevated bed, but at least building a frame around your garden in order to level it off. Growing on a slope doesn't work real well. Are there humps or bumps or low areas? And do you know what the land was previously used for? Is there any chance that there could be toxic chemicals in the ground? You need to decide whether or not you're going to use a raised bed. And raised beds can be anywhere from 2 to 4 inches tall to like 18 or 20 inches tall. You'll have to bring in extra soil if you do that. And the advantage is that they're raised off the ground. So if your soil is too poor for a garden, you can build a raised garden on top of the ground and grow in that. A raised bed garden also works well for people who are somewhat mobility handicapped, and in that they don't have to bend down as far. You can even do an elevated bed that someone like could sit in a chair at and work in the garden. Another thing to think about when you're siting your garden, will you need to have animal pest control? It's pretty hard to get away from the animals that will use your garden for their lunch. Even in the city, we have deer in the city and rabbits and that sort of thing. So you may find that you have to fence your garden or put row covers over, which are very lightweight covers that you put over the plants. The sun and the rain and everything comes through, but the animals can't get at it. And the first thing it should be is to call Digger's hotline. There's now a shortcut, I think it's 811, before you start digging, because if you interrupt utility lines, it's a major inconvenience for the people who lose service, and it's also very costly because you are responsible for all of the repair costs. So that could be really, really expensive. Let's see, we'll go on here. When are you going to plant your garden? As you can see this spring, we've had some real roller coaster weather. But generally, you plant it in a certain order. You start with cool season crops, and then you go to warm season crops. The cool season crops are like beets, peas, carrots, cabbage, onions, broccoli transplants, greens, radishes, turnips, lettuce. These can be planted as soon as the soil can be worked in the spring. And how will you know that? Take a handful of soil and squeeze it in your hand. If it holds together, but then when you touch it, it crumbles apart, the soil has the correct consistency. So it's not going to be too wet. If you try to work in a garden that's too wet, the soil, especially if you're working with clay soil, will form clumps, and they're almost impossible to break up for the entire season. So don't rush it. I remember one spring a couple of years ago, we had rain until the first part of June or well into June. And people who planted their gardens at that time, by the end of the growing season, had almost the same output as the gardens that people put in real early in the mud and the rain. So many times the vegetables will catch up. In central Wisconsin, those early cool season vegetables can be put in the very last part of April to early May, and it depends on the weather. If we get warm weather again towards the end of next week or so, it might be okay. If it continues to be cool, it might be well into May before you want to plant those plants. Warm season vegetables, on the other hand, you need to wait to plant until the danger of frost has passed. And many of these are vegetables or plants that really like a lot of heat. So if you put them out too soon, they're going to be stunted by the cold, and they just will sit there and not really do anything. In fact, they may even be set back by the cold, and it will take them longer to recoup than if you had waited to put them out when it was warmer. So cool season crops, as soon as you can work the soil in the spring. In central Wisconsin, that's late April to early May. And then mid-spring crops, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, cauliflower, if you're planting these from seed in the garden or even transplants, they can tolerate a light freeze or a frost, which means the temperature might get down to 32, 34, maybe even 30, but it doesn't go too much lower than that. And in central Wisconsin, this is usually about mid to late May, depending again on the weather. Those warm season crops need warm soil and cannot tolerate cold temperatures. In central Wisconsin, that's the end of May to early June. A very cheap and inexpensive way to tell when the soil temperature is right is to buy a soil thermometer, and you stick it in the ground and it will tell you what the soil temperature is at 4 inches. And plants like peppers and tomatoes really need a soil temperature of at least 60 degrees to do well. This is a planting guide for central Wisconsin. I believe it's in one of the handouts that is in the resources list. And it's used in this way. For example, beans, that's considered a warm season vegetable. So that would probably be planted around the first week in June. And it tells you how many to plant per inch if you're planting them in a row. And each plant will need a space of 4 by 4 inches. It's going to get medium high. We're talking about bush beans here. Some shade is okay, but not like an all-day shade. Days to harvest is probably 50 to 60, and you can succession plant. That means you could plant beans on June 2nd, and then you could again plant some maybe the middle to the end of June. So when the first crop is done, then you have a second crop to succeed it. Beets, again, these are a cool season crop, so that could be put in maybe as early as April 22nd. 2 to 3 inches between plants, and they need about a 3 by 3 inch area to grow. Their height is pretty short. It's a root vegetable, so some shade is okay. And again, you can plant them at about 2 or 3 week intervals to have fresh beets all summer if you have the room. So that's how that is used. So broccoli, for example, this is one that you can put out as a transplant. So you would start the seeds indoors around the end of March and transplant out around the beginning of May. This needs an area of 1 foot by 1 foot, and you would want to put the plants 18 to 24 inches apart. So that's how that chart works. And we've got, wow, there we go. We've got all kinds of different vegetables here. So you can pick what you want to do. A single planting season means that it takes the plant long enough to grow that you can only plant one plant in that space at a time, and it's going to be there all season because it takes that long to grow. How to plant. Okay, I'm going to tell you about a planting scheme called square foot gardening, and whether you do this in a raised bed or you do this in just a big garden plot, it can be done either way, but it's a way to grow the most vegetables in the smallest space. And it started out in a country that has very poor growing conditions, and they wanted to figure out how could they get the most vegetables growing in the smallest area. And so they invented this growing plan. For example, this looks like it's a 3-by-4 foot bed. And notice that the sides don't have to be too high if you're doing a raised bed. It's just that you have a border around the bed so that you don't have to step in it and compact the soil, which means then you don't have to do cultivating either. So a square foot garden can be as small as 2 feet by 2 feet, or as wide as 4 feet, and as long as you would like them to be. A common size is about 4 by 8 feet, and then you leave a space, and then you have another bed 4 by 8 feet, so you have space to walk around it. So it's not real long to walk all the way around. And the idea of the 4 foot wide is that you can reach in from both sides without stepping in the garden. You can put dividers then in your garden at 1 foot markings. You can see there's little markings down here on the frame. This can be strings, garden pieces of wood, any material that you can use that you'll be able to see that it's divided. Some people even just draw lines in the soil to start with. So it's kind of up to you. There's a basic planting pattern for the square foot garden, and each square is planted according to the species of plant that's growing in it. So for example, this is the 16 plant pattern, and this would be used with carrots, radishes, and leaf lettuce. So you put 1 seed where each of those black dots are. So in this square, you'll have 16 carrot plants. The idea is that the carrots need that much space in order to develop fully, but they don't need much more than that space either. So you're not wasting any space between plants. Some people make like a template. So you have this foot template and you drill 16 holes in it, and then you stick a seed where each of the holes are. The 9 square planting pattern would be the size that you would use for beets, onions, kohlrabi, and peas. So in other words, there would be 9 plants in this 1 foot square. A 4 square pattern would be green beans, head lettuce, spinach, and okra. And the 1 plant pattern, these are for your larger plants: tomatoes, peppers, cabbage, broccoli, potatoes, those kinds of things. So there are some advantages to this pattern. Each square is planted with the most plants that will provide enough space for each plant to grow to full maturity, yet save as much space as possible. And it greatly reduces thinning because you only have to look to see whether more than 1 seed sprouted in each spot. And if so, then you take out the extra seed. Whereas if you plant radishes in a row, you might plant 100 seeds in a 3 foot row, and then you've got to take out 60 of them. So it saves a lot on thinning. Another advantage is as the plants grow, they fill the square and they eliminate the sunlight on the soil, so you get less weeds. In fact, if you weed a square foot garden once when the plants are small and maybe once more, that's probably the majority of the weeding you're going to have to do all season. That shade also conserves the soil moisture too, because the sun is not beating down on the soil and drying it out. There's no space that's used for paths between rows. So if you have a row of carrots that takes up 4 inches wide, and then you have a foot wide row where you can walk along the row, and then you have another row of carrots that's 4 inches wide, you have 3 times as much space left that where you're walking than where you're growing. You don't have to till a square foot garden because the soil is not compacted by walking on it. And so you would only need hand tools for planting and weeding. You don't have to have a rototiller or anything like that. Bed layout considerations. Okay, where in your garden should you plant different things? Crops should be rotated to different places in the garden each year. And the bigger garden you have, the more rotating you'll do. If you have a small garden, you just do the best you can. If you planted the tomatoes on one side last year, you plant them on the other side this year. Rotation helps to control disease and insect pests that may overwinter in the soil, or especially on debris if you leave it, the dead plants in your garden over the winter. You will want to rotate plants in each spot to a plant that's not in the same plant family. And these are some common plant families. Carrots, and that includes carrots, celery, parsley, parsnips. The goosefoot family, which is beets, spinach, and Swiss chard. The gourd family, which is all of your melons and squashes. Grass family includes corn, popcorn, and sweet corn. Mallow family, the only thing we grow for food in there is okra. The mustard family, that's all your things related to cabbage, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, kale, radishes, rutabaga. Nightshade family is eggplants, peppers, tomatoes, and potatoes. So when you're doing your garden, if you planted tomatoes in an area one year, you don't want to follow that with potatoes or peppers. You want to put those in a different place of your part of your garden if you can. There's the onion family, then the pea family, which is basically peas and beans, and the sunflower family, which is lettuce and endive and all those kinds of vegetables. So if you can rotate plants, if you can rotate so that the same plant family is not in the same space for at least 2 or 3 years, it's even better. But if you just have a small garden, you just do the best you can. Vining crops, things like tomatoes, cucumbers, melon, and squash should be staked or trellised, put in cages or fenced to keep them from sprawling. And not only does it save space, it also keeps the tomatoes and melons and things off the ground. And so they are less likely to rot and spoil. Taller plants should be on the north side of the garden bed because they're going to throw a shadow unless they are purposely used to shade some other plants. For example, you might want to shade lettuce so it keeps growing longer into the hot weather because it's partly in the shade. Adding flowers to a garden also attracts pollinators. Zinnias, marigolds, salvia, and cosmos are some of the better ones and better behaved ones to put in among your plants in your garden. And mix up the varieties, different species in adjacent squares. So you don't want to plant three squares of carrots in a row. You want to intermingle those with some other vegetable families so that if insects come to your garden, they have to keep hunting a little further to find the rest of your carrots, for example, if they want to lay eggs on them. So it kind of helps with disease control too. You have only one square that may get diseased and the other ones might not be affected because they're a little further away. Companion planting, people often ask about that. It's not a very well-researched topic, although it's the old wives' tale or the farmer's almanac kind of thing, that certain plants can benefit by being planted near certain other plants, and that some plants do not do as well when they're planted near certain plants. Some of the assumptions that's based on is that plants that attract specific insects to feed on them can be used as a trap crop trap crop to keep the insects from eating the preferred crop. But you have to plant the trap crop a little bit farther away in order for that to be effective. Peas and beans are good near almost any crop because they fix nitrogen that other plants can use. If you pull out pea or bean plants at the end of the season, you'll see little nodules on the roots, and those are the nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they actually add nitrogen to the soil. And nitrogen is a nutrient that all plants need to grow well. Some plants repel pests, or they are strongly scented, and that confuses insects looking for their preferred food. And these might be things like herbs, parsley, dill, that have a stronger scent. Some plants attract beneficial insects that feed on the harmful insects, thus protecting your preferred crops. You can try it. I added a handout to your resource list, but it's kind of an inexact experiment at this point. But some people swear by it and other people say it doesn't work. So this would be an example of a garden map. And you can see that this would be a 4 by 8 foot garden. And the things are kind of mixed up. We have peas on a fence here because they need something that will support them. And then when that's done, they're going to take not too long, maybe 50, 60 days. You can always plant lettuce later. You could also plant beans in that area, bush beans, they would work. In this area here, carrots take a long, long time to germinate. And many people interplant that with radishes because the radishes will be ready to eat in about 30 days. The carrots will just be barely getting a start. So you get 2 crops from that one square. You notice here that we've added on the bottom here some flowers to bring in the pollinators because they are needed to pollinate the tomatoes and the peppers and that sort of thing. This tomato over here is an indeterminate, which means it'll grow very tall. So I put that on the corner so that it doesn't block too much of the wind and that it will get enough wind from the various directions to keep the diseases away. Some of these plants where they say plant 1 in a square, the tomato may actually needs more space than just 1 foot. So I planted next to it some spinach, which will be done in about 45 days, and some lettuce, which is an early lettuce. So these 2 squares will be empty by about the time that these 2 tomato plants start getting really big and needing the extra space. Same thing up here in these 2 squares. And again, lettuce over here, that by the time these tomatoes get pretty big, they have some extra space to grow. So give it a little thought to where you're going to plant some of the vegetables and mix them up a little bit. We also can do succession cropping, and that would be planting one plant after another plant. So if one plant takes just a very short time to grow, let's say radishes, and they are a cool season crop, so you plant those early. And by the time the radishes are done, you still have the warm weather season coming, and you could plant carrots in there then. You could plant bush beans. You could plant salad greens. Or maybe you want to start out with some spinach, and then after that plant, say, some bush beans or some beets or some kale, and that would, then you get 2 crops out of 1 square. One of the things that you also might do is to put in a crop that takes almost all season, followed by garlic, for example, which is planted in the fall, and then you've got that garlic planted for the following year. Or the garlic, when the garlic gets ripe in July, you can follow that by kale or some more lettuce or maybe a late planting of broccoli. Intercropping means you're planting two crops in one space. So we saw radishes between the carrots. You could have short season salad greens like spinach and leaf lettuce between tomatoes and peppers. Garlic between tomatoes, because the garlic will be, by the time that gets ripe and you take it out, the tomatoes will be getting pretty big and they can use the extra space. This is an example of a square foot garden after it's growing for a while. You can see that they have the melons here on a trellis. There's looks like some peas back here on a trellis, tomatoes back here in a cage. Over here you can see there's like a square of Swiss chard. So the idea here is to grow up, not out. And that saves space. Okay, before you plant plants outside, you have to harden them off. So if you've grown them from seed inside, they're used to being in your nice warm house and getting plenty of water, not having much wind and weather to deal with. They have a light on them probably, but it's not as strong as the sun. So you need to get your plants used to being out in the weather, and that's called hardening off. Plants that you purchase in a greenhouse may or may not be hardened off, so you should ask when you're buying them, are these ready to go in the garden or do they need to be hardened off? So hardening off is done by placing plants outside in a shady, wind-sheltered place for the first day. And then on successive days, you gradually increase the amount of sun exposure. Maybe the next day they get an hour of sun, following day, maybe 2 hours of sun. And then you move them gradually to a place where there's a little bit more wind. And after about 7 to 10 days, the plants should be in full sun and unprotected and ready to plant in the garden. What you're doing is helping the plant to develop an extra layer of cells to toughen up their leaves for outdoor conditions. If you do not harden off plants, very often when you plant them in the garden, the leaves will turn yellow or brown and drop off. Sometimes the plant will be able to sprout new leaves and sometimes not. But you're going to lose a couple weeks of growth while the plant is growing all those new leaves. Okay, planting plants outside. If you can, choose a cloudy, calm day or a late afternoon if possible, so that the shock to the plants being put in a new space is not too great. Before you plant, smooth the soil, remove all visible weeds, dig a hole that's larger than the pot that the plant is in and about as deep. Loosen the plant from the pot and remove it. And that's done by placing the stem of the plant between your second and third or your third and fourth finger. Put your hand over the top of the pot and then flip the whole thing upside down. You might have to squeeze the pot a little bit to remove the plant from it. If the root ball looks very, very crowded, gently tease some of the roots apart and spread them out. Or if it's really, really matted, just take a knife or a razor blade and cut in, just so you cut the very outside roots on all four sides of the root ball. This will get the roots to thinking about moving out instead of growing round and round and round like they were in the pot. Place the plant in the hole, adjust it for height so the plant is just slightly lower than the soil level, and then water the plant well and let that water sink in. Then start adding soil around the root ball and adding more water, especially if the soil is dry, and then firm the soil so that there's good root contact and no air pockets. Leave a little slight dish depression around the plant to hold water so that when it's young and you water the plant, the water is going to stay right near the plant and not run away. Label the plant. If it had a plant tag that came with it, or if you grew it yourself, make some kind of label, or write on your garden plan what plant you planted in what space. That's another way to do it. And add any supports at the time of planting. So if you're going to put a cage around your pepper, put that in now so that when you poke the cage into the soil later, you don't break off all the roots. Let's see, planting seeds. Rake the soil surface smooth again and remove all visible weeds. Use the square foot planting guide to make small indentations in the soil where the seed should be placed, and then plant 1 to 3 seeds at the depth indicated on the seed packet. Most people, the error they make is planting the seeds too deep. So be careful that if it says 1/4 of an inch, that's barely covered by soil. So you don't want to put too much soil over the seed. Occasionally, you'll even find like lettuce seed that says do not cover at all. So in that case, you don't put any soil over the top of it. Firm the soil over the seed, press it down so you make good seed soil contact, and water gently but well. You don't want to wash the seeds away. Label the square or the row as to what's growing there. And then when you when the seedlings start coming up and they have 1 or 2 sets of true leaves, you need to cut off all but 1 seedling for each hole. Don't pull the extra plant because you're likely to pull out the one you want to leave too. So if you're row planting, you thin that way to the recommended spacing. We say plant 1 to 3 seeds. If you have fresh seeds, it's probably safe to plant 1 per space in the square foot gardening plan. If your seeds are old, like they're 2 or 3 years old, then you might want to plant 2 or 3 seeds, depending on how old the seeds are and what kind of shape they're in. You can always cut off the extra ones. After you've planted, water the plants at the soil level to prevent diseases. If you splash water on the leaves stay wet. Wet leaves are probably the number one generator of plant diseases. Most diseases like that wet conditions. Keep the seeds, if you've planted them, moist at all times until they're germinated. And that may mean that you have to water or lightly water at least once a day, maybe even twice, depending if the weather is really hot or windy, and that the soil dries out much quicker. And then you can gradually start decreasing the water after the seedlings are 2 inches tall. And at that point, you water only when the soil is dry, at least 1/2 inch below the surface. So it's not necessary to water every day. Stick your finger in the soil up to about your first knuckle. And if you feel moisture, you don't need to water necessarily. Weed as needed. It's much easier to weed after you've watered or rain. Do not let the seeds flower and go to seed. 1 year's seeds is 7 years weeds, is a saying. So it's much easier to pull them out before they go to seed than to have to weed and weed and weed in the following years. Mulch to conserve water, cool the soil, and prevent weeds. Things like straw, shredded leaves, coconut hulls, dried grass clippings if your lawn has not been treated. These are some of the preferred mulches for vegetable gardens. You don't want to put anything in there that's going to last more than 1 season. And when the season, or over the course of the season, if something becomes diseased, like leaves start turning yellow or something, or you notice that there is starting a disease on the plant, get rid of those diseased parts right away, because they just keep adding more and more and more to it. If you're container gardening, you're growing your vegetables or flowers in a container, you need to choose an appropriate size container for the plants. Obviously, you need a much bigger container for growing a tomato plant in a container than if you're going to grow, let's say, salad greens in a container. A regular sized tomato plant would need at least a 5-gallon pail, and you're probably better off with even a bigger container than that. If you're growing flowers and you have a lot of flowers that you're putting into a container, you're going to have to water that more often. In fact, you need to water containers much more often than vegetable gardens because they do dry out much quicker. Use potting mix, not garden soil. Garden soil is too heavy. It doesn't allow the plant roots to breathe. And it doesn't also hold the moisture. Potting mix usually has peat moss and other additives to hold the moisture. The number one rule, make sure the container has drainage holes in the bottom, or you're going to end up rotting the roots of the plants. And we said they need to be watered oftener. Some sites for container gardening that are good. For recommended varieties, there's this PDF, and it's also listed in your resources. Or if you're looking for words or plant descriptions, look for words like compact, patio, short vine, perfect for containers, bush, determinate. Those are all plant descriptions that mean that the plant is generally smaller than the counterpart that you would put in an in-ground garden. So there's a number of resources on that resource sheet that will tell you where to look for the kinds of plantings and put together in containers and that sort of thing. Some other concerns as the season goes on, fertilizing is only indicated by a soil test. Don't just put fertilizer on for the sake of putting fertilizer on. If you fertilize early, it usually results in a lot of leaves on the plant, but much less fruit. In fact, sometimes plants like peppers might not grow any peppers at all. They have lots and lots of leaves, and they're beautiful looking plants, but they don't grow any peppers because there's been too much fertilizer put on them. They need to have a little bit of sparseness before they're convinced that they need to make flowers and set fruits. Once the tomatoes and peppers have little tomatoes and peppers on them, then you may want to add a little fertilizer. Use the NPK ratio recommended by a soil test, and that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Most soils in Wisconsin have enough phosphorus and potassium. Nitrogen is the one that's often lacking. And again, you can get organic fertilizers like blood meal is a great nitrogen fertilizer, or you can go the route of the synthetic fertilizers. Weeding, you need to remove the entire root or many weeds will grow back. Weeds compete with the vegetables for water, space, and nutrients. Weeds can also attract insects, which can eat your plants or transfer diseases when feeding on the plants. There are wild plants, we call weeds, in all of those families that we looked at as vegetable families. And so if an insect really likes that family and you leave those weeds growing in your neighborhood, you're going to be attracting those insects to your garden, and they'll eat the plants in that plant family in your garden too. I have an instance of that 2 summers ago, and nearly all my peppers, new growth at the top, looked kind of twisted and stunted. And I sent one to the plant pathology lab, and he said, well, you know, I would say that it looks like somebody sprayed Roundup near your garden. And I said, well, nobody did that. And he said, well, then the other thing I suspect is that an insect transferred some virus to the plants when they were feeding on it. So that's one of the reasons that why you want to keep weeding, as well as not having to weed and weed and weed the following years. Diseases. If you notice that a plant is obviously diseased, Don't put that in your home compost pile if you have one, unless you're a hot composter, and that means your compost pile heats up to at least 140 degrees. Most backyard compost piles don't do that. Avoid treating any plants that have a disease until it's properly diagnosed. The way you treat a plant depends on the disease it has, and if you just treat it with any type of treatment, the chances of you treating it with the right one are small, and you don't get the results that you want. The plant's going to die anyway, and you've just wasted a whole lot of money. So the Plant Diagnostic Clinic down in Madison will test plants if you don't know what they have. Master gardeners can usually, if you have a plant question and you describe it to master gardeners on our website where you ask a gardening question, we can very often give you an idea of what it is based on the symptoms your plant has. Same thing goes for insects. Hand pick most of them. And before you just go willy-nilly spraying pesticides, you need to identify the pest also. Some of the insects we find on our plants are actually there because they're eating the bad insects. For example, ladybugs love aphids. So if you have aphids on your plants and you go, spraying, you're going to kill the ladybugs too, probably. And they would have controlled the aphids without you having to spray at all. So you need to avoid any chemicals unless the infestation becomes quite severe. And then again, make sure that that the pest, the insect on the plant, is a bad insect and not a good one before you spray. And again, master gardeners can help you with identifying insects. If we can't do it, there's also an insect diagnostic lab down at the University of Wisconsin. Let's see, some other concerns. We talked about mulching before. It cools the hot soil, keeps the soil moisture in, prevents weeds from growing. As it breaks down, it adds nutrients to the soil. You want to wait till after the soil has warmed in early summer, though, if you're going to mulch things like peppers and tomatoes, because they like the soil to be warm. So wait for the soil to warm up and then add your mulch. Shredded leaves, straw, shredded newspaper, purchase paper mulch, cocoa hulls, thin layers of untreated dry grass clippings, and other organic material are preferred. Plastic mulch, it has to be able to let the water through. Otherwise, you're going to have to put irrigation or drip hoses under the plastic because you can't water through plastic. Also, the plastic is not organic. You can't compost it, so you add more to the landfills and whatever. So for most gardening purposes, at least vegetable gardening, avoid the plastic mulch. I would also avoid it for flower planting, things like foundation plantings, putting mulch underneath rocks, or putting plastic underneath mulch allows a layer of debris to eventually accumulate on top of that plastic, and that grows weeds just as well as the soil. The other thing is, if you cut a hole in a plastic and you put in, let's say, well, I was asked to replant some daylilies because he said they're all dying. Well, we dug them up and found out that the mulch was strangling the plants. And so that also can happen with plastic mulch, and it wouldn't happen with an organic mulch. When you're harvesting your vegetables, learn what a ripe vegetable or fruit is supposed to look like, so you're picking it at the best point. Then harvest at that peak for the best flavor, texture, and nutrients. You need to keep harvesting many plants in order to keep them producing. If you don't pick the beans or the peas, they'll stop making more. If you don't pick the tomatoes, they'll stop making more. So you need to keep harvesting in order to keep the plants producing. The plant's main job in this whole wide world is to make enough seed to reproduce itself. And so if you keep picking the vegetables, the vegetable goes into overdrive, or the plant goes into overdrive and makes more vegetables because it's trying to produce that seed. Do not let fruits rot in the garden. This will attract insects and vermin and all kinds of other things, and also create a good disease nursery for all kinds of diseases in the garden. Take out plants that are no longer producing, and you can compost them if they're not diseased. And then replant with other short maturity plants for a second crop. And you want to keep the soil covered either with mulch or a second planting so that you don't have to weed so much. Other things to think about when you're out gardening besides the actual plants in the soil and that sort of thing. Wear UPF clothing or use sunscreen or a hat, sturdy shoes and gloves when you're out gardening. Use ergonomic tools that are well maintained. So if your tool is supposed to be sharp, it should be sharp. If you have physical issues, try to find a tool that fits best in your hand, for example, that you can use with less strain. Use good body mechanics, safe bending and lifting. Lift with your legs, not your back, that sort of thing. If you can pull or slide something across the ground rather than picking it up and carrying it, that works good also. Warm up before starting heavy work tasks. Just like you would warm up for any other form of exercise, it's important that you also warm up before you do any heavy gardening tasks. Whoops, we lost a page here. Where did we go? There we go. Drink plenty of water. Use protective clothing. Oh man, oh, I touched the pad here. Where we find it here? There we go. Drink plenty of water. Use protective clothing, eyewear, and that sort of thing when you're using chemicals. And always follow the label directions, especially when you're using any other kinds of chemicals. The label direction is the law. So if you do not follow the label directions and something happens, you're not covered at all. And there's generally warnings on chemicals, where they should be used, what kind of plants they should be used on. Some can be used on some plants and some can't be used on others. So be sure you read the entire label before you go about using any chemicals in the garden. And I keep losing the last part of my slide here. Okay. When I do gardening talks, I like to also make people aware of certain invasive species. These will be coming up in the next month. You might be seeing them before the next month's Garden Guru program. One of them is garlic mustard, and it's an invasive plant. If it gets loose in a wooded area, it ends up choking out all other native plants. It likes the shade or part shade. When you crush the leaves, they have a garlic odor, which is a very, very easy way to tell what this plant is. The flowers have 4 tiny petals, and they grow on a flowering stalk, and the leaves are alternate, which means one grows to the left, the next one grows to the right, goes up, the next up to the right, rather than 2 leaves coming out in opposite directions in the same place. You need to dig the root or pull out the whole plant. If the flowers are present, you need to just put them in a trash bag, the whole plant, and dispose of in the trash. I've seen this cut off at ground level and flowers growing right at ground level. This plant does not give up easily. You can tell it's garlic mustard also. It has a bend in the root right below where it goes into the ground, kind of an S-shaped hook. On the upper right here, you can see the seed pods, and you might not even be aware of this until you see the flowers and then the seed pods. In the bottom right, this is what it looks like in the first year. The first year, it doesn't get the flowers. It just has this low little area of kind of rounded leaves. It looks almost like Creeping Charlie, if you know what that is, but the leaves are a little bit bigger. And it doesn't grow flowers until the second year. This is the other one that will be coming out soon. It's called Dame's Rocket, and some people confuse it with wild, they say, oh, that's wild phlox. Nope, it's not. It has 4 petals and phlox has 5, so that's how you can tell the difference. It spreads readily by seed. It likes moist shaded spots. And again, this is a 2-year plant. The first year, it looks like the plant on the bottom. It's just that round little circle. It's called a rosette of leaves. And then the second year, it gets the flower stalk. And these, again, if you need to pull them if they have flowers on them and put them in the trash, because both of these plants, if you just pull them and leave them laying on the ground, the seed will still develop on the plant and be able to reseed again the following year. So with that, we have any questions from anybody? See, there's something in the chat. Okay, I guess that took care of that.
There haven't been too many questions tonight, and what we had, we've already discussed. So we'll give everybody a few moments here, see if anybody ends up with any questions that they were holding on to. So Rose Johnson asks how to keep Japanese beetles out of a garden.
Japanese beetles, yes, it's the bane of gardeners since they showed up. There's really no way to keep them out of the garden. Hand picking is recommended, especially on vegetable crops, because you don't want to be spraying them. I know they're terrible on beans, zinnias, raspberries, roses, grapes. In fact, they killed a basswood or linden tree on the lot next to us 2 summers ago, just completely stripped it. Hand picking, discouraging them. There is an organic compound, oh gosh, I would have to look it up for sure. It's a BT strain, beetle, can't think of the name of it. It was on the market, then it was off, but there's another one. Tell you what, if Bethany can email that to me or get your email, I'll try and get back to you on that. I see something, jumping worms. Yes, jumping worms are in this area. If you want to know if you have them, look at your soil. The soil, rather than looking like plain soil, will look kind of like coffee grounds. It'll be kind of coarse and grainy. And if you want to be sure, you can mix up some dry mustard in water and pour it over the ground, and the jumping worms will come squirming out if you have them. They're very, very hard to treat. The main way people get them is by trading plants with someone who has them in the soil in their garden. And that's the major reason why many of the master gardener organizations are no longer having plant swap sales anymore, where they share some of their plants with the public, because it's really hard to know you have the jumping worms until you start seeing that soil changes in your garden. And there's really nothing you can do after that to change it back again. Their behavior, they're much more wiggly. That's why they call them jumping worms than regular garden worms that you'll find. They whip their tails. Sometimes they even lose the end of the tail. So it's kind of a scary looking thing. And you can also tell a regular worm from a jumping worm. The jumping worm, on a regular worm, there's a structure on it, starts with a CL, and that's a raised band around the worm. Jumping worms have that band, but it's not raised. So that's another way to tell if the worms you have in your ground is a jumping worm or a regular worm. Otherwise, they're kind of the same color too and about the same size. Let's see. Clay soil. The best thing you can do to add to clay soil is compost and any other kind of organic matter, like shredding up leaves in the fall and tilling them into your garden. And if it's a perennial bed, even just those shredded leaves on the top, the worms and other soil creatures will gradually incorporate them into the soil. So adding that organic matter is the best thing you can do. And again, using organic mulches like cocoa hulls and wood chips and that sort of thing, so that when they break down, that becomes part of the soil too. Let's see. Ask questions to Master Gardeners. There's a website on Facebook called Wood County Master Gardeners. On there is a link where you can ask a gardening question. And we usually monitor that from about mid-May through the end of September or during the growing season to answer questions. The one that you have on there will go to Madison. But locally, if you live in the Marshfield area, it's Facebook, and just on Facebook, go to Wood County Master Gardeners. Any other questions? Good questions.
Yeah, they have been. Well, I think that might be it for the questions this evening.
Another thing on jumping worms, if you can, when they're really bad, cover the plant with a row cover kind of thing. It's a very lightweight, thin fabric. But if you have vegetables that need to be pollinated, like tomatoes and peppers and raspberries, time that the flowers are open, you can't do that or you won't get pollination. But if you're really trying to save, let's say, a rose or something like that, you might be able to cover it to keep the beetles off of it. It's another possibility.
Well, that might be about it for the questions then. I just pulled up the link for the Wood County.
Yep, that would be it. Oh, thank you, Lynn. Next month's gardening guru will be small space and container gardening. And the one in June will be what we call integrated pest management. It's how to control diseases and pests without using so many chemicals.
All right, I think that is it for this evening, so we will wrap this up. If you have any follow-up questions, you can always send them my way. I am happy to direct them to Donna. And if Donna isn't immediately able to answer them herself, she has all those resources to help figure out where it needs to go so that you can get that answer. But as Rose was so kind enough to ask where to send other questions to, we do have those couple of links. We did have the question regarding Asian beetles, and I am going to send an email to Donna so that she can get me some information, and I will include that in a follow-up email if Zoom will let me. If not, I will throw her response into the resources folder. So if you check back in about a week, and it should be in there, whatever we're going to have, if you have not received an email. So if that's something you're interested in, just make a note, remind yourself.
One thing I forgot to put on this slide set, if you have gardening questions and you want to look up the answer yourself, in your search engine on your computer, let's say you want to find out Japanese beetle control. So put that in Japanese beetle control extension, and then that will bring up the articles that I go to look for the answers to these questions. So that's one way you can do it, and it'll bring up articles by university extension services all over the country. So, you know, if you're looking up how to grow apples, well, you would want to find one from Wisconsin or Minnesota or Michigan, because their climate is like ours. You wouldn't want to be growing apples in California. So, but that's another very, very, very good resource. If you don't want to wait for somebody to answer your question, you can look it up yourself.
All right, well, I think we will wrap it up there. Thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. Hope you have a great rest of your night, and hopefully we'll see you in one of our upcoming Garden Guru sessions. Have a great night.